see you all. I want to welcome all of the students and also welcome people from the community who might be dropping in to see what we're all about. This lecture is one that we have presented several times. Each time, Professor Bittner says, "You've heard this all before," and yet I seem to, on some level, be able to hear something new in what he has to say. And he's one of our best lecturers. Otherwise, I wouldn't ask him to come back.
Thank you.
Right. So, Dr. Stephen Bittner, who probably will want you to call him Steve, grew up in a small town in Michigan. When we first made connection, we were surprised to find out that my family had actually, and I had actually, when I was a young child, spent some time near where he grew up, near Lake Michigan. He attended the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor and got his BA degree. And after taking a short break, he went to the University of Chicago to pursue a Ph.D. in Russian history. Before coming to Sonoma State in 2002, he was a visiting professor at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, and a fellow at the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies in D.C., which is a very prestigious organization. He's lived for periods of time in Chicago, Washington, Moscow, and even in Columbus, Ohio, which is a very difficult thing to do if you're a graduate of the University of Michigan. Right?
That's true. Yeah.
He lives in Santa Rosa, married, and has 2 children. He's written 2 books, The Many Lives of Khrushchev's Thaw, which is about a neighborhood in Moscow during the Khrushchev regime, and also Greenwich Village, I forget the second one.
The Kremlin Scholar.
The Kremlin Scholar, right. There we go. Which is about a high-ranking Soviet official who got himself into some trouble because he tried to do some regime change. His newest project is a very exciting one. We've talked about it. And he spent a balmy winter break in Odessa, Russia, and Steve is studying winemaking on the Crimea and in Georgia. He's quite an accomplished scholar, and I am most grateful to have him come and give this lecture. So won't you welcome Dr. Bittner.
Okay, I hope there are no Ohio State fans out there. This is probably the 4th or 5th year that I have spoken here. And I think this is the first year looking out at you, I don't see very many familiar faces. So how many of you have had me before as your professor? Okay, so a good number of you. Hopefully I won't repeat anything that you have heard me say before. We're, as faculty here at Sonoma State, we're under orders this year to cut our workload by 10%. I wanted to make sure that this wasn't something I cut, because I very much enjoy having the opportunity to speak to you all. And I always say at the outset of my talk here that I am the least accomplished speaker you will see this semester. The Holocaust Lecture Series is really unique on Sonoma State University's campus because of the quality of speaker that it brings to this classroom. And as Myrna said, I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan, this lecture series reminds me a lot of what a big research university is like. So if you're wondering how your lives differ from your friends that went to UCLA or UC Berkeley, this lecture series should give you some sense of what a major research university offers. Okay, so I have to start with a disclosure, and my disclosure is that I'm not a historian of Germany. As Professor Goodman said, I'm a historian of the Soviet Union. So I'm an outsider to this field that you have dedicated your semester to. What that means is that if you ask me a really tough question, I may deflect it to somebody else sitting right there. But because I'm an outsider, that doesn't mean I haven't thought a great deal about the Holocaust. In fact, as Myrna mentioned, I spent my intersession in Odessa. Odessa is the second largest city in Ukraine. At one time it was the Jewish Babylon, the greatest Jewish city in the world, until the Romanian occupation during the Second World War. There were, at one time, 80 synagogues in Odessa. Today there are 2. In fact, the archive I worked in is located in the building of a former synagogue. And let me tell you, it's drafty. It was very cool. Okay, so I'm not a specialist on the Holocaust. I'm an outsider to the field. But this doesn't mean I haven't thought a great deal about the Holocaust. And in truth, there's a good deal of overlap between scholarship on the Soviet Union on one hand, and Stalinism on one hand, and on Nazism on the other. And what joins these two fields together is this concept of totalitarianism. And totalitarianism is a word, I think, that has a lot in common with the word terrorism. It's so overused that it has lost whatever meaning it once had. But 50 years ago, this was a word that was coined by 2 political scientists at Harvard University, a guy named Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, to refer to regimes like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that had, in their view, totalizing ambitions. That is, these are regimes that aspire to control the whole totality of the existence of their citizens. And in the extreme manifestation of totalitarian regimes, even the will to resist was destroyed. And of course, if you've read George Orwell, you probably have some semblance of what that means. Now, Nazism and Stalinism are also linked by the concept of genocide, what I'm going to speak about today. Although this comparison is less frequently made, and in my mind, it's not a very useful comparison, since I don't think the Soviet Union was ever a genocidal regime. And this may come as a surprise to some people in this room. And by the way, let me say that when we compare Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, this is one comparison where the Soviet Union comes off looking pretty good. In fact, this speaks to one of the great ironies of 20th century world history. That is, the Soviet Union, a communist country, saved the capitalist West from fascism. And if you take my Soviet history courses, you will learn that the Second World War, what we celebrate here as the War of the Greatest Generation, was in fact a war that was principally fought between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And of course what this means is that the Soviet Union was the principal victor over fascism. It's also true that the Holocaust was primarily an Eastern European event. Okay? And this is important because our image of the Holocaust here in the United States tends to be one of Anne Frank holed up in her attic in Amsterdam, right, and those nefarious collaborators in Vichy France. But the truth is that the vast majority of people who perished in the Holocaust resided in the East, that is, in the eastern part of Europe. In fact, if we include lands that were partitioned by the Soviet Union in 1939, when the Soviet Union gobbled up half of Poland as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, About half of the victims of the Holocaust were citizens of the Soviet Union. Okay? So what this means is that this was fundamentally an event that occurred on Soviet territory. And it's also true that the heartland of European Jewry, so that part of Europe where most Jews lived, was located in the Soviet Union. It's the territories that used to be called the Pale of Settlement, where Jews by Tsarist law were confined. And today the old Pale of Settlement is located in Ukraine, in Belarus, and in the Baltic Republic of Lithuania. So I guess that qualifies me to speak to you today about the Holocaust. Now, if I were to ask you what the Holocaust is, or what the Holocaust was, I am confident that nearly everybody, if not everybody in this class, could answer that question successfully. Right? The Holocaust was the event where German soldiers and political leaders and bureaucrats and their non-German abettors planned and implemented the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, and then smaller numbers of Roma. What are the Roma? Gypsies, yeah, good. Slavs, handicapped persons, homosexuals, and communists. So, as such, the Holocaust is the central event in all of German history. It was the central event in modern European history. It colors our understanding of what it means to be German and what it means to be European. And it forces us to rethink events as central to European history as the Enlightenment. What exactly is the Enlightenment? Those of you who have had me before as a professor, you should definitely know this. Yeah? It comes before the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment was a cultural phenomenon, an intellectual phenomenon, that gives us, among other things, the French Revolution in 1789, the American Revolution in 1776. Broadly speaking, it was a philosophical, political awakening. Began sometime around the year 1650, lasted until about 1800, and it was characterized by enlightened political leaders, like Catherine the Great in Russia and Frederick the Great in Prussia, who tried to apply rational scientific law to the realm of politics. Now, the Enlightenment gives us a very dangerous idea. The Enlightenment proposes that human existence can be perfected by the application of rational law, scientific law, to the public realm. Now, if we accept that proposition, if we accept that we can perfect our existence here, then we have to answer a different sort of question, and that is, what are we willing to do to achieve that utopia? And I would argue that that sentiment was really central to the Holocaust. Okay, so if I were to ask you what the Holocaust was, most of you could answer. But if I ask you why the Holocaust happened, I suspect you would find it more difficult to answer. And why did hundreds of thousands of seemingly normal, intelligent, and otherwise moral German citizens participate in mass murder? And then why did millions and millions of their countrymen do nothing to stop it? Now, as the historian Daniel Jonah Goldhagen has pointed out, a few of your answers to this question would probably have as much to do with the nature of human existence, what Joseph Conrad famously called the heart of darkness that supposedly resides in all of us, than with the individual motivations that prompted people to participate in mass murder. Now, I'm not so naive to think that we're going to answer this question today. Why did the Holocaust happen? In fact, I'm pretty confident that in 100 years, knock on wood, if this lecture series is still going, we'll still be asking that question. But I do think it's an important question. And I don't think we should immediately attribute the cause of the Holocaust to some ambiguous heart of darkness. Because those sorts of answers are the answers that tend to efface guilt. Okay? And in my mind, the Holocaust was fundamentally a problem of criminality. Okay? And if it is a crime, there are people responsible for that crime. And today, I will point some fingers. Okay? And you need not necessarily agree with my prescription of who is to blame for this. But most of all, what I want to do today is to provide you with some conceptual tools so you can begin to make sense of the Holocaust as a historical event and the sorts of structural reasons that, in my mind, made the Holocaust possible. And then I'll move on to the specific reasons that allowed the Nazis to come to power in the early 1930s. And then I'll end very briefly by talking about the ways that historians, professional historians, have made sense of the Holocaust. Okay, so let's start with these sort of structural reasons that sort of laid the foundation for the Holocaust. And I have three of them. And my first structural reason for the Holocaust is anti-Semitism. Now, a former speaker in this lecture series, and arguably the most famous living historian of the Holocaust, a professor in Tel Aviv named Yehuda Bauer, has pointed out that this term, anti-Semitism, is stupid. In fact, that's how he describes it. It's a stupid term. In other words, there is no doctrine of Semitism to be opposed to. So how can there be a thing called anti-Semitism? Now, nonetheless, in common usage, anti-Semitism refers to animosity towards Jews, but interestingly, not toward other Semitic peoples, like Arabs. Okay? Now, in some forms, anti-Semitism is as old as Christianity itself. Many verses in the New Testament strike the reader, the modern reader, as anti-Semitic. There's a reason for this. They probably reflected tensions in the early Christian church between Jews that embraced the new religion and Jews that resisted the new religion. But much of Christian anti-Semitism hinges on one idea in particular, and that is that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. According to the book of John, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem, was ready to pardon Christ, but was convinced otherwise by a hostile Jewish crowd. According to the book of Matthew, Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, helped fabricate evidence against Christ. And in fact, that's what got Mel Gibson in trouble. You remember his movie. But actually, in fairness to the book of Matthew, a broader reading suggests that Caiaphas fabricated evidence against Christ in order to stave off a Roman military incursion. So in other words, he was willing to sacrifice one person in order to save many others. But as a result of this, until the 20th century, it was accepted doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. And this alone was often the cause of popular animosity towards Jews in Europe. For instance, when the plague hit Europe in the 14th century, there were persistent rumors that it was caused by Jews who had poisoned the water. There were also rumors, in fact, really tenacious rumors, that survived well into the 20th century, that Jews used the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzahs. Everybody knows what a matzah is, right? It's an unleavened bread that is almost inedible. When I was in college, we used them as frisbees. Along with Muslims, Jews were targeted by the Crusades. Crusades were these military ventures that lasted from the 11th to the 13th centuries to free the Holy Lands from Muslim control. Jews were objects of the Inquisition, that is the arm of the Roman Catholic Church that prosecuted heresy. In the 12th and the 13th centuries, Jews were repeatedly expelled from France. They were expelled from Spain in 1492, a year that figures prominently in our own history. They were expelled from Prussia, not Russia, Prussia, the predecessor to the modern German state in the 1700s. And as I already mentioned, in the Tsarist Empire, the Russian Empire, where many displaced Jews eventually settled, they were confined to what was called the Pale of Settlement. In large swaths of Europe, Jews were forbidden from owning land. In fact, this gives us that most pernicious of stereotypes about Jews, that Jews are merchants and money changers. And of course, there's a grain of truth in every stereotype, and the reason this stereotype exists is precisely because Jews were forbidden from making their living the way virtually everybody else did. They couldn't farm the land. Unexpected or unexplained tragedies frequently resulted in pogroms. This is a Russian word. It means little storm or popular uprising. So my point is that anti-Semitism has been with us for a very long time. But that does not mean that anti-Semitism is unchanging. In fact, over the course of the 19th century, anti-Semitism changed in a really fundamental way. And that is, anti-Semitism became less religious in orientation and more racial. Okay? And this reflected two important developments among Jews. First of all, the European Jewish population was increasingly assimilated. So what this means is that Jews lived their lives in cities. Many were no longer practicing. Many men no longer wore a beard. They didn't wear the yarmulke. In the Russian Empire, movement in and out of the Pale of Settlement was tolerated. And so what this meant is that in virtually every big city in the Tsarist Empire, there was a reasonably substantial Jewish population. In some cases, a very substantial Jewish population, like in Odessa, where in 1900, 70% of the population was Jewish. So that's one reason why this switch from religious to racial anti-Semitism occurs. A second is that this transformation reflected a number of pseudo-scientific theories that were in vogue in the 19th century. And these theories had a great deal of currency among learned people like yourselves. And they attributed various defining characteristics to various ethnic and racial groups. And now, whether or not you want to admit it, we have all heard these stereotypes, right? Englishmen and Americans are individualistic, Germans are punctual, Irishmen are drunkards, and so on and so on. Now, unfortunately, Jews were associated with less savory characteristics. Jews were seen as being greedy, as being rootless, and as being cosmopolitan. And interestingly, the value of cosmopolitan meant the same thing 150 years ago that it does now. That is, it means having a worldly outlook. But the value was reversed. That was seen as a bad thing because it meant that Jews supposedly had little loyalty for the nation. And instead, they pledged their allegiance to various transnational groups like the Jewish diaspora, or to political movements like Zionism, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, or even sometimes communism. So you may have noticed that there's a contradiction here. Some people see Jews as being greedy capitalists, and other people see Jews as being nefarious communists. And oftentimes these seemingly oxymoronic stereotypes were held by the same people. So how can you be a greedy capitalist and a conniving communist? Well, this is what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls the viscosity of Jewish identity. Right? And viscosity is this word we normally use in regards to motor oil. It is a measure of slipperiness. And Bauman, I think, rightly points out that historically Jewish identity has always been a very slippery thing. That is, it's easy for anti-Semites to perceive Jews as arch-capitalists, greedy in the extreme on Monday, and then on Tuesday, the same anti-Semites perceive Jews as conniving, atheistic Bolsheviks, communists. Now, this is hardly an exhaustive list of the indignities that Jews have been subjected to over the last 2,000 years, and nor is it meant to be. But I do want to make a point that the historian Jan Gross makes in his history of the Holocaust in the Polish village of Jedwabne. And that is, before the Holocaust, from the perspective of Jews, anti-Semitism was a lot like an intractable, low-intensity war. Okay? So you had to be savvy in order to survive. A mistake, a casual glance, anything like that could lead to a pogrom, to this popular anti-Semitic uprising. But the point is that this intractable, low-intensity war was survivable. In all but a few exceptional cases, the Holocaust was not. Okay? Okay, so that is my first structural reason for the Holocaust. My second structural reason is the emergence over the course of the 19th century of nationalism. And what exactly is nationalism? Yeah?
Is it like strong loyalty and pride in your nation?
Well, what then is the difference between nationalism and patriotism? Anybody have any idea what this doctrine is? We know it's a doctrine, right? It ends in ISM. If you do the New York Times crossword puzzle, and they ever give you the clue doctrine, and it's a 3-letter answer, it is always ISM. Take my word. Yeah?
Is it like extreme loyalties, but to the point where the country comes first, not the family?
Okay, well, maybe. Any other ideas? Well, here, I'll give you a useful one-sentence definition of nationalism. Nationalism is a political doctrine that holds that each nation should have its own state. Okay? And so that then forces us to define what a nation is, and this is a good deal easier. A nation is a group of people that imagines they have some affinity that binds them together. Right? So like the German nation is bound together by shared ethnicity, shared blood. The French language is bound together by their capacity to speak that beautiful language. The American nation is bound together by certain core beliefs that are enshrined in the Constitution. Okay? So nationalism then is the doctrine that says that each of these national groups, each of these nations has the right to have its own state. Now, despite what nationalists say, nations have been with us for only a very short time in human history. I think that human beings have existed for about 20,000 years since we emerged on the plains of Africa. And nations have only been around for about 200 years. Okay? In fact, nationalists are quite good at positing the roots of the nation in the distant past. In fact, oftentimes that's what it means to be a nationalist, is to falsify the history of the nation. So even the oldest nations today have only been with us for about 200 years. And then in Eastern Europe, many of the nations there are a good deal younger than us. Okay? Now, in Western Europe, the signal event for early nationalists was the French Revolution in 1789. And the French Revolution located political sovereignty, that is the right to rule, in the broad body politic, in society as a whole, rather than in a narrow aristocracy or in notions of divine right. In Central and Eastern Europe, nationalism grew a bit differently. In Central and Eastern Europe, nationalism was affected in important ways by a cultural movement we call Romanticism. And we should do big R, Romanticism here. And here I'll fess up, I have a relative that writes romantic novels. You occasionally see her fiction on sale at Safeway, but she makes far more money than I do. But that is romantic literature with a little R. And Romanticism with a big R refers to a cultural movement in art and thought and sensibility, in which feeling and emotion were emphasized instead of science and rationality. Okay? And Romanticism was a response to the Enlightenment. And in fact, oftentimes we call Romanticism the counter-Enlightenment. Because Romantics denied the idea of historical progress. Okay, so the Enlightenment gives us this very seductive notion that history is the story of continual progress. That our lives are better than our parents, and our children's lives will be even better yet. And of course, what makes this progress possible is scientific advancement, the application of scientific law to the political sphere. And the Enlightenment proposes, then, that in the end of time will be distinguished by the emancipation of all men. So there's kind of a teleology. Enlightenment thinkers thought we were moving towards something like this sort of age of universal emancipation. Now, Romantics were highly skeptical of these ideas. They were frightened by this growing confidence that marked enlightened societies like revolutionary France and the newly independent United States. Romantics were skeptical about science. They were skeptical about the claim that man had mastered the secrets of nature. And Romantics tended to emphasize this sense of anxiety that the modern man felt. Now, the classic example of Romantic literature is something that probably most of you are familiar with, and that is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And what is the moral of Frankenstein? Who has seen Frankenstein? You see the Boris Karloff version? Okay, so what's the moral of Frankenstein? Should we be robbing graveyards in the middle of the night and piecing together life? Yeah, what's your name? Yeah, exactly. That there are some realms into which man dare not explore, right? Like issues of life and death. Now, in Germany, two of the central figures of the Romantic movement were a poet named Johann Gottfried von Herder and the composer Richard Wagner. Probably some of you have heard of Wagner if you haven't heard of Herder. And both Wagner and Herder celebrated folk culture. In fact, they thought that in folk culture there was located the kernel of the authentic national self. Okay? So in other words, if you want to know what it means to be authentically German, you don't go to a cafe in Berlin or to Hamburg or to Breslau. You go to a peasant village. And there, among these illiterate, unwashed peasants, you will discover the authentic kernel of Germanness. Now, of course, what's ironic about this all is that Wagner and Herder were polyglot intellectuals. Polyglot, that means that they spoke lots of different languages. They were learned, they were cosmopolitan, they were worldly. And they were idealizing the lives of peasants. Okay, but that was not uncommon among Romantics. Now, as a political doctrine, Romantic nationalism was and is one of the most successful of all time. Over the course of 100 years, Europe ceased to be a continent of empires, and it became a continent of nations. And nations, these are states that base their right to exist upon the national group. Okay? So I'm just going to read through a list here of the nations that become independent and when they become independent. And this is probably beyond the scope of what you need to note in your notebook. But you should be aware that this is one of the cardinal events of European history over the 19th century. Okay, so Serbia becomes an independent nation state in 1815. Greece in 1829. Romania in 1859. Italy in 1861. Germany in 1871. Bulgaria in 1878. Albania in 1912. Czechoslovakia in 1918, and that's an unusual one because that's a state that is comprised of two nations, the Czechs and the Slovaks. And then along with Czechoslovakia, all the new states that were spawned by the First World War. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Ukraine, and Turkey. And these states were carved out of empires. Okay? But nationalism also caused problems. And can you go ahead a slide here? Oh, I have forgotten something. So I mentioned those pseudo-scientific theories about defining characteristics attributed to certain races. Here you see, this is a picture from a German elementary school in the 1930s, and these school children are being instructed in this pseudo-racial science. Okay, go ahead, one more slide. Go ahead, one more slide. And I'm clearly out of order here. One more. Okay, I don't see them. Well, you guys have all gotten a handout, right? A handout of statistics. And unfortunately, I don't have them in front of you. But these statistics illustrate that national borders were never perfect. Okay? So there were Romanians who lived in Russia, and Ukrainians who lived in Poland, and Germans who lived in Czechoslovakia, and Turks who lived in Bulgaria, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so millions and millions of Europeans lived outside their titular nation state. Okay? So the borders that were drawn didn't reflect the complexity of the national portrait of the European continent. And then, of course, there were Jews. And Jews had a national ideology, Zionism, but they had no nation state. And in fact, they don't have a nation state until after the Second World War, right, with the foundation of Israel. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to my third structural reason for the Holocaust, and that is militarism. Okay, by 1870, every major European power maintained a standing army, and a standing army doesn't mean all the soldiers were standing up. It means an army that exists even in peacetime. This is a relatively new idea. It used to be the case that soldiers convened in times of war, they fought, and then if they survived, they went home. They didn't make a career out of the military. So by 1870, every major European state has a standing army, an army in peacetime. And states are spending increasing sums of money on weapons production. In France, between 1875 and 1914, military spending doubled. And that is in adjusted terms, adjusted for inflation. In Britain and Germany, military spending tripled over that time period. And in Russia, by 1914, military spending accounted for a full 1/3 of all state expenditures. Now, as a point of comparison, Here in the United States today, military spending accounts for about half of all discretionary spending. And discretionary spending is half, again, of the total budget. So that means military spending accounts for a quarter of total government expenditures. On the eve of World War I, there were 19 million men and even women in uniform on the continent. And military thinking and military values began to pervade European society. Technology spurred on this arms race. The French introduced the machine gun in the 1860s. New industrial processes made possible the development of far larger and more accurate pieces of artillery. By the beginning of World War I, the Germans had artillery pieces that could launch a shell 75 miles. That would mean they could park their artillery in Belgium and launch a shell over the English Channel. There was also advancements in naval technology. Iron-bottomed warships came into use. By the early 1900s, this led to the development of a vessel of unprecedented size, what the British called a dreadnought, what we call the battleship, which is basically just a floating artillery platform. And then even more ominously, European countries began to experiment with chemical weapons. And of course, the First World War saw fairly widespread use of chemical weapons, although not very successful use of chemical weapons. You always had to be careful which way the wind was blowing. But more important, in my view, than these technological advancements, the very idea of violence became culturally acceptable during the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. So Marxists, social Darwinists, liberals, racists, they all thought that struggle between people was historically necessary. And jingoism, which is a very bellicose form of patriotism, became the accepted form of patriotic expression. So you would not only express your love of your country, but your hatred of all others, or at least your country's rivals. And this enthusiasm for violence led to extremely low rates of desertion in the First World War. In fact, the French command expected that desertion rates in the First World War would be somewhere between 5 and 13%. In fact, desertion rates proved to be somewhere in the vicinity of 1.5%. So what this suggests, I think, is that many people accepted the idea that violence was necessary. Okay, so those are the sort of broad structural developments that I think paved the way for the Holocaust. And so now I'm going to move on to the specific events that brought the Nazis to power in 1933. Okay? Well, Nazi success built upon the failures of German liberalism. And this word liberal means something very different today than it meant 70 years ago or 150 years ago. Liberalism used to refer to respect for the free market and respect for civil liberties. Okay? And in the wake of the German defeat in the First World War, the modern German state is reconstituted as a liberal democracy, what we call the Weimar Republic. And it's called the Weimar Republic because this democracy was proclaimed in the city of Weimar. And the Weimar Republic lasted until 1933. And during this period, it was arguably the world's most democratic state. And of course, it had many weaknesses, and it seems like every kid in high school in the state of California is told about the weaknesses of Weimar. There was the onerous reparations of the Treaty of Versailles. I think even more damaging was the fact that the new civilian leadership of the Weimar Republic was forced to accept defeat. And that really discredited them in the eyes of many Germans. But there was also a great deal of political polarization in this early Weimar Republic. For instance, on the very day that the Weimar Republic was proclaimed, November 9th, 1918, German socialists proclaimed the existence of a pro-Soviet socialist republic. So in other words, two states were proclaimed to be in existence on the same day. And in fact, there was an aborted revolution in 1918 in Germany. And for a couple of weeks, it was pretty dicey. It wasn't clear which way Germany was going to go. Was it going to become a liberal democracy like the United States and Great Britain, or was it going to become a pro-Soviet socialist republic? And then over the course of the 1920s, this political polarization was manifested in a handful of right-wing uprisings that fed on popular disenchantment and on economic impoverishment. Now, in the summer of 1929, the American economy slipped into recession. In October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange tanked. Europe collapsed within just a couple of weeks. And after the crash, American financiers, American banks on Wall Street, were no longer able to infuse capital into Europe. And this was especially damaging for the Weimar economy, because the Weimar economy was dependent upon American loans in order to repay the Versailles reparations. In fact, that was part of the plan that was drawn up by Charles Dawes, the American vice president. By 1932, American investment in Europe had fallen by 70%. Now, Germany was the first country in Europe to experience political upheaval on account of the emerging Great Depression. In parliamentary elections in September of 1930, German voters stunned the pundits by handing 107 of 611 seats in the German parliament, the Reichstag, to the National Socialist Party. And few people had even ever heard of this party in 1930. But overnight, the Nazis went from being an inconsequential party to comprising the second largest bloc in the German parliament. So in other words, the Nazis were the prime beneficiaries of the economic chaos that began in New York in 1929. Now, of course, the Nazis were led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was an Austrian by birth. He was born in 1889. As a young man, he had wanted to become a painter, but he was denied admission to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. This raises wonderful counterfactual historical questions. What if only he had become a painter? And actually, I've seen some of his paintings, and they truly are dreadful. Kitschy, I think is how you would properly describe them. Hitler served with the German infantry in World War I, and he twice received the Iron Cross for surviving poison gas attacks, and that's the German equivalent of the Purple Heart. After the war, Hitler joined the Nazi Party. He was not the founder. He joined the party. And Nazi, of course, this is an acronym for National Socialist, and this requires a little bit of explanation. Socialist here is not meant to be understood in the Marxist sense. Rather, it referred to the sense of solidarity that was supposedly felt by German veterans of the First World War, in the sense of betrayal they felt. Right? Because those of you who know your history of the First World War, the Germans weren't actually defeated on the battlefield. Rather, there was a wave of strikes at home that forced the Germans to sue for peace. So that sense of betrayal is what is this label socialist is supposed to capture. In 1923, Hitler was arrested for participating in a coup against the Bavarian government in Munich. The coup plotters were caught before any damage could be done. And Hitler was sentenced to 9 months in prison. And while he was in prison, he wrote the book that would become the Bible of the Nazi movement, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In My Struggle, Hitler laid out his view of history. He was clearly inspired by Marxists, strangely enough, because he felt obliged to come up with a theory of history. That's the one great thing that Marxists produce, a theory of history. Marxists argue that class struggle is the engine of history, what pushes history along. Hitler, contrarily, argued that racial struggle is what pushes history along, struggle between the races. And he argued that the master race, what he called the Aryans, who were the predecessors of the Germans and the Brits, were ordained by God to be the implacable foe of lesser races, especially the Jews, but also the Slavs. Now, according to Hitler, Germany had to adopt an aggressive foreign policy to achieve its historical destiny. He thought that the German army had to conquer Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe. He thought that this expansion would anger France, which was Germany's traditional rival on the continent. But he thought that Britain would never intervene to stop German expansion eastward. Because after all, Anglo-Saxons were also descendants of the Aryans, part of this Aryan race. And so they would realize their racial affinity with the Germans. So these were the core elements of Nazi ideology. We had this idea of racial superiority on the one hand, and then an aggressive foreign policy and the need for expansion on the other. Okay, so how exactly did Hitler come to power? Well, it was almost by accident. Despite their impressive showings, in the 1930 Reichstag elections, they still played second fiddle to the largest party in German politics, the Social Democrats, the center-left party. By 1932, the Nazis had become the largest party in terms of representation in the Reichstag, but it was still far from a majority. So there are 611 seats total. In 1932, the Nazis occupied 230 of those seats. And there's even some evidence that suggests that at the end of 1932 and the beginning of 1933, the Nazi phenomenon was beginning to wane. And so in other words, the Nazis were beginning to lose some electoral support. And interestingly, they were bleeding support to the party on the far left, to the communists, not to other parties on the right. And I think that suggests that what we often imagine as a political spectrum defined by a left and a right is actually a circle, right? You go far enough left, you actually come back right. But that may explain why so many of my liberal friends like Ron Paul. I'm not sure about that. The Nazi phenomenon appeared to be waning at the end of 1932 and the beginning of 1933, but clearly something had to be done about the Nazis. And the solution to the problem that the Nazis posed, was proposed by Paul von Hindenburg, the German president. And actually, some of Hindenburg's aides proposed that he simply ban the Nazis. Well, actually, they wanted him to ban the Nazis and the communists. But Hindenburg, because of his commitment to liberal democratic values, refused to do that. Right? Because people, after all, have the right to assembly and the right to voice their political opinions, however odious they might be. So Hindenburg refused to simply ban the Nazi Party. But he came up with something else instead. He offered Hitler the chancellorship. And this would be basically head or the equivalent of a prime ministership, the head of government. And as chancellor, Hitler would rule over a coalition cabinet where Nazis occupied only 3 of the 11 cabinet seats. And in the eyes of Hindenburg, once Hitler was in power, he would have to act more responsibly. Right? And power often does that. People say outrageous things when they're running for office. They tend to moderate their views once they're actually in power. But Hindenburg actually thought that Hitler would become little more than a puppet. That the more moderate powers could easily control behind the scenes. So Hitler was offered the chancellorship, and I do have a photo of this. Can you go back a couple slides? One more. Okay, here we go. So this is the moment right here where Hitler is actually invited into the cabinet. So once Hitler was in power, he demanded that new elections be held to the Reichstag, as was his prerogative, and these elections were scheduled for the beginning of March 1933. But on February 27, 1933, the Reichstag burned down. And the fire was probably set by a Nazi arsonist, but Hitler blamed the communists. In fact, one of the persons that was arrested was a central figure in the Comintern, a Bulgarian communist named Georgy Dimitrov. By noon of the following day, February 28th, there are 28 days in February, right? Normal month? 28, okay, February 28th. By noon of the following day, 4,000 communists had been arrested. And Hindenburg signed an emergency decree which suspended individual liberties, basically suspended the Weimar Constitution. And in the ensuing days, Nazi thugs terrorized their political opponents. And this set the stage for a Nazi electoral triumph in elections to the Reichstag on March 5th. The Nazis won 44% of the vote. Still not a majority, but they had an ally in what was called the Nationalist Party. And so with the help of the Nationalist Party, Hitler could reign supreme. Less than 3 weeks later, the Reichstag approved the Enabling Act, which allowed the government to rule by decree for 4 years. So Hitler became a dictator within just a couple of weeks, even though a majority of the German population had never voted for the Nazis. Okay, and I point that out not to efface the guilt of Germany. As you'll see, I'm going to point some fingers here. But that is historical fact. 44% was the peak Nazi electoral success. Now, 2 factors made the Nazi expansion so rapid. First, the Nazis relied on the work of the Gestapo, secret police, later it was called the SS. And secondly, thousands of bureaucrats and state officials joined the Nazi Party in order to advance their careers. They thought it was the healthy thing to do from a career perspective. The traditional institution in German society that was most likely to give Hitler trouble was the army. It is certainly the case that the generals in the German army had no respect for Hitler. They basically thought he was a dangerous adventurist, that they were right. But of course, Hitler needed the support of the military in order to pursue this aggressive foreign policy. So he accused several key figures of the German military of homosexuality, and he ordered the secret police to assassinate them. And these assassinations occurred on the night of June 30, 1934, an event that becomes known in German history as the Night of Long Knives, the assassination of these generals in the military. And then 5 weeks after that, in August of 1934, Hindenburg died of natural causes, and Hitler then combined the offices of Chancellor and President. Now, effective opposition to the Nazis may also have come from Christian churches in Germany. If you look at who's actually voted, or who was actually voting for Nazis in 1933, they tended to be Protestant. Okay, so most Nazi voters were Protestant. But most Protestant clergymen were politically neutral. A small handful of Protestant clergymen actively resisted Nazism. And some of these clergymen, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, then perish in concentration camps and then are resurrected as post-war German heroes. And I think when all is said and done, about 800 Protestant clergy perish at the hands of the Nazis. Now, effective opposition may also have come from the Roman Catholic Church. But in 1933, Hitler signed a treaty with the Vatican and with Pope Pius XI. And in this treaty, Pope Pius XI gave his stamp of approval to Nazism in return for a promise from Hitler that the Nazis will respect the traditional confessional liberties that Catholics had enjoyed in Germany, because Catholics were in a confessional minority in Germany. But whatever the case, Hitler's assurances to Pope Pius XI that he would respect Catholic confessional liberties proved entirely worthless. Over the course of the 1930s, the Nazis ruthlessly attacked Catholic schools and Catholic youth groups. Eventually, Pope Pius XI decided that the 1933 treaty was a terrible mistake. And in 1937, he writes an encyclical. Encyclical is a papal document called "With Burning Sorrow." And in this papal encyclical, he attacked all forms of totalitarianism, both Nazism and Stalinism. But sadly, from the outset, Pope Pius XI was more reluctant to attack Nazi anti-Semitism. There is no more controversial subject, I think, in Holocaust studies today than the role of the Roman Catholic Church. Some historians argue that the Pope was personally complicit in the Holocaust. Others, I think, argue that at best he turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions and millions of European Jews. Now, Nazi racism was directed primarily against the Jews. In 1933, after Hitler came to power, he expelled most Jews from government positions in the German state. 2 years later, in 1935, he issued the infamous Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws denied German citizenship to persons with 2 or more Jewish grandparents. So that then becomes the legal definition of Jewishness, 2 or more Jewish grandparents. It prohibited marriage and sexual intercourse between Germans and Jews. And it required Jews to wear the yellow Star of David when they were in public. German towns could refuse residency permits to Jews. And German businesses could fire, and in fact were encouraged to fire, their Jewish employees. So, obviously, many Jews knew that this wasn't good. And by 1938, about 100,000 German Jews had fled abroad. And if they were lucky, they fled to the Soviet Union or to America, because unfortunately, oftentimes they fled to other parts of Europe, where they then got caught up in the Holocaust. On November 8th of 1938, Nazi terrorists subjected those Jews who remained to a night of violence, what is called Kristallnacht. Can you go ahead one more slide, please? And I see I have November 10th on there. November 8th to November
9/10, they call it.
9/10, okay, good. Scores of Jews were killed. Thousands were dragged from their homes into the streets and beaten. 200 synagogues were burned. 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Now, Hitler's government actually blamed the Jews for these disturbances. And 25,000 Jews were incarcerated as a result of the violence of Kristallnacht. I think I have a couple more slides here. Can you go forward? Okay, and one more. Okay, I'll get to this. Okay, so far what I have been talking about is I think what we can call the disemancipation stage of Nazi policy regarding the Jews. That is, everything I've said so far the purpose of that was to make the Jews as unfree as possible. Disemancipation, the opposite of emancipation. What made the Nazi program so unique was their subsequent attempt to annihilate Jews through a very methodical genocide. And of course, Hitler wanted Lebensraum in the East, and according to Heinrich Himmler, this would require the annihilation of 30 million Slavs. And Slavs were only one step higher on the racial hierarchy than Jews. They were regarded by true-believing Nazis as subhuman. And to this end, to the end of murdering Slavs, Himmler authorized special SS action teams to slaughter at will in the Soviet Union. And the war with the Soviet Union begins on June 22nd, 1941, the first day of summer, the day you have the most daylight. And as during that first week, about 3 million German and Romanian troops crossed the Soviet frontier, and they were followed by these Einsatzgruppen. And you see here the activities of the Einsatzgruppen. Typically, they forced their victims to dig their own graves, and then they lined them up on the rim to be shot. Millions and millions of Soviet citizens died in this manner. And I say millions and millions, I can actually be more precise than that. About 3.7 million Soviet citizens died in this manner. Jews, Slavs, communists. Now, even lower, of course, than Slavs were the Jews in this Nazi racial hierarchy. And Hitler was determined to eradicate as many of the 11 million Jews who lived in Europe as possible. Soon after the outbreak of war in September of 1939, Jews in Poland were herded into ghettos. First in the city of Lodz, and then in Warsaw, but then also in other cities. It was from these ghettos that many Jews were sent then to be killed in concentration camps. But actually, life was so miserable in these ghettos that the annual mortality rate hovered somewhere in the vicinity of 20%. So these ghettos were a means to isolate Jews from the rest of society while their ultimate demise could be planned. In July of 1941, Hermann Göring, at Hitler's command, issued the fateful order for the mass murder of Jews. And in the order, it is phrased as a total solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Then the following January of 1942, Nazi leaders met in a Berlin suburb, Wannsee, to map out plans to deport Jews to camps specially equipped to exterminate large numbers of people in an efficient manner. Execution by machine gun was deemed too inefficient and too costly. The preferred method was the gas chamber, and this had several advantages. After death, dental fillings could be removed before corpses were burned in crematoria. The bones and ashes could be used for fertilizer. Some corpses were boiled to produce soap. The most notorious of these concentration camps was in the Polish city of Auschwitz. Can you go forward one more slide, please? One more slide. And by the way, that sign was just stolen a couple months. Did you read about that? They recovered it. But,
Swedish.
Yes.
The Swedish skinhead.
Oh. I was hoping it was just a case of drunken teenage vandalism.
No, it was a Swedish skinhead.
Okay, so Auschwitz was a model of German efficiency, and here you can see I am attributing a certain characteristic to the German people. They are efficient. Auschwitz was a model of this efficiency. It was capable of killing up to 12,000 people a day. By the end of the war, Auschwitz alone was responsible for the deaths of 2.5 million people, mostly in gas chambers. Another 500,000 people were worked to death at Auschwitz. The Nazis also tried to exterminate other people they considered inferior: gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and the mentally ill. And by the way, a couple of years ago, I spoke here, and after I finished, a young woman came up to me and she said, I'm so glad that you mentioned that Jehovah's Witnesses were also victims of the Holocaust. But that is true. They were targeted by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Between 1938 and 1941, the Nazis perfected their gassing technique on 70,000 mentally ill Germans. German scientists perfected a form of cyanide known as Zyklon B, that when it was exposed to air, it became gaseous. But even at its most efficient, Zyklon B took 15 to 20 minutes to kill its victims. Now, at first, Allied and Jewish leaders were absolutely incredulous at the reports of genocide that were filtering out of the East. And I think to some extent, we can sympathize with them. The scale of this all simply defies belief. But over time, the number of reports accumulated, it became clear that this was truly happening behind German lines. But even then, no effort was made by Allied leaders to either bomb the camps or to bomb the rail lines leading to the camps. There were a handful of underground church groups, mostly Protestant ones, who assisted Jews. But Pope Pius XI and then his successor, Pope Pius XII, never directly condemned the atrocities, even when Jews in Rome were rounded up and put on cattle cars. And in fact, there was scant sympathy for Jews in Poland among the Roman Catholic clergy. The previous Pope, John Paul II, has testified to this. His shame being a young clergyman, a seminary student in Poland, his shame at the anti-Semitism he witnessed among the Roman Catholic clergy. There were instances of heroism. The Danes, that Professor Goodman has written about, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Italians organized large underground resistance networks that saved tens of thousands of Jews from murder. But efforts to blame this all on a mere handful of deranged Nazis are really, in my mind, indefensible. Approximately 50,000 people were directly involved in the implementation of the Holocaust. So German soldiers, German politicians, French collaborationists, Polish clergy, the list goes on and on and on. And few of these people were ever held accountable for their crimes. Okay, so I promised you that I would end briefly with a few words on how historians have made sense of the Holocaust in the, 60-plus years since it ended. And for a long time, this debate, there were two sides to scholarly debate about the Holocaust. There was the intentionalists, and there were the functionalists. Okay? Well, the intentionalists argued that the Holocaust was the product of Nazi willfulness. Okay? So in other words, the roots of the Holocaust could be found in the origins of the Nazi Party, in the sort of unique form of German nationalism, affected as it was by Romantic thought, Herder, Wagner. You could read Hitler's Mein Kampf, find this kernel of the Holocaust, the Nuremberg Laws, and so on and so on. So in other words, the Nazis had a master plan to destroy the Jews from day one. And once they were in power, they acted on that plan. Okay, so that's the intentionalist view of the Holocaust. The functionalists argue that there was no master plan. Although they do recognize that the deep anti-Semitism of Nazi leaders, they argue that there was no master plan until quite late in the game to eradicate Jews. They argue that the Holocaust instead was the result of a specific confluence of events. And you can almost think of this, I think, as an hourglass tipped up on its side, right, where these events all come together at that point where the glass converges. They tend to emphasize rivalries within the bureaucracy and careerism. And I think in this sense, the classic text of the functionalist viewpoint is a text I assigned to my freshman and sophomore students, Hannah Arendt Eichmann in Jerusalem. Now, more recently, there has been a willingness to think of the Holocaust outside this functionalist, intentionalist divide. I already mentioned Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. Goldhagen has tried to ascertain the individual motivations of people, German soldiers who participated in the Holocaust. There's a historian at the University of North Carolina named Christopher Browning, who has written a book called Ordinary Men, where he tries to do much the same thing. Right? I mean, for every person that was killed, there was somebody who did the killing, and there was a reason why that person did the killing. And so these historians have tried to investigate that. And then, more provocatively, there's a Polish historian named Jan Gross, who's on faculty at NYU, who has gone so far as to question the centrality of German soldiers in the Holocaust as it played out in Poland. And Gross, who very much considers himself a Polish patriot, and undoubtedly this research is personally painful for him, has shown that in this village that he has chronicled, Jedwabne, in Poland, that German soldiers were actually peripheral to the Holocaust. So the Germans arrived, and then there was this kind of spontaneous uprising among residents of the village against their Jewish neighbors. And the Nazis played very little role in it at all. And then let me mention one additional scholar of the Holocaust, this Zygmunt Bauman, who is actually a sociologist, not a historian. And Bauman has placed the Holocaust in the broader trajectories of modernization and Enlightenment thought. And I know Professor Bittner doesn't like Bauman. I'm very fond of him. But he asks very provocative questions, like the Enlightenment gives us the French Revolution and the American Revolution. It also gives us the Holocaust. So does the Holocaust then force us to rethink the benevolence of the French Revolution and the American Revolution? Okay, that is all I have to say for today. I have 20 minutes. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to hazard an answer. Yeah?
I was just curious if Hitler and his regime informed like the German citizens who were his followers, like in depth of exactly what he was doing with these Jewish people, the gypsies and
Mira, you want to?
No.
No.
Although we shouldn't assume, though, because of that Germans were in the dark about all of this. In fact, one of the concentration camps in the West was liberated by American soldiers, and the day after liberation they paraded the villagers through the concentration camp. And of course there was this, oh my God, what is this? But that appeared to have been mostly feigned. You couldn't help but be aware that this was...
Right. There was a whole language that sprang up that we'll talk about eventually, which is, euphemisms, like we have peace-seeking missiles. Well, the final solution. Words were used that did not describe what was actually going on. I've read a lot of memoirs, and one of them that I read, which was very prominent to me, was of a woman who was in the upper classes, and she wrote a diary, a contemporaneous diary. She wrote it during the war. This isn't the stuff that came after. And she wrote, because she was able to read the papers from Switzerland that had reports about what exactly was going on, she wrote in her diary, God help us when this war is over because of what we've done to the Jews. So, and I've also talked to someone who was a child in Nazi Germany who said his mother used to say to him, "You behave yourself or I'll send you to Dachau." People knew that there were bad things associated with these places.
And that was an issue in the trial of Eichmann too, the euphemistic speech. And of course the only reason you speak euphemistically about mass killing is because you know it's wrong. If you think it's perfectly okay, there's no reason to speak euphemistically about it.
So people knew something was happening, and you know, it's human nature maybe to just deny it. But if you had a Jewish neighbor and you woke up one morning and they were gone, wouldn't you wonder where they were and what happened to them and look after them? So it wasn't, you know, there wasn't TMZ going to people's houses and saying, "What happened to these people?"
I'm impressed you know about TMZ. Do you know who Perez Hilton is?
Yes.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I noticed that not once did you mention the word appeasement in your lecture, and I was particularly struck by several moments of appeasement. Hindenburg's appeasement to Hitler with the chancellorship,
Neville Chamberlain.
appeasement, and then you mentioned you point fingers, but the less level appeasement. I'm wondering, as a historian, how you would classify that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair point. And let me, this word appeasement. Of course, the classic case of appeasement is the Neville Chamberlain's trip to Munich in 1938, where he agrees to sign over what the Germans called the southern lands, the northern part of Czechoslovakia, where there was large numbers of ethnic Germans, the Sudetenlands. And then Neville Chamberlain returns triumphant and says that war has been prevented. And of course the moral of that, as it has been re-articulated by the likes of George Bush and others, is that you can't appease dictators, right? And from my standpoint, it's more interesting. I'm a Soviet historian, and the Soviets saw that event as a sign that the capitalist West would never stand up to fascism. And so that then forced Stalin to authorize his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, to open up negotiations with Nazi Germany, and those negotiations produced in 1939 the Stalin-Hitler Pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which pledged 20 years of non-aggression between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And of course, Stalin thought that he needed that breathing space. He thought that the war was inevitable, but he needed that breathing space in order to continue to industrialize. And of course, he got not 20 years, but less than 2. Any other? Somebody had their hand up and back. Yeah.
Do you know how long it took them to create these death camps and build them?
Auschwitz was first, it was a military base, and they started building it in 1940, and it wasn't fully operational until about the end of 1942. But there were other camps that we'll learn about that were just kind of pieced together, and there were a lot of people who were killed. They were never even settled in place. They were loaded onto gas vans that had the exhaust pipes that went back into the van itself, and people were gassed that way.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I see not so much a question as a statement. I see a similar thread. Bad things happening, and nobody's standing up and shouting and saying. It seems to me that throughout our world today, people are being oppressed. I see our liberties somewhat being threatened, but nobody stands up and shouts or something. Nobody says it. And I think that was the common denominator, that nobody said it.
What is the inscription on the Holocaust Memorial in Martin Luther King in the back of campus? Something to that effect.
Right.
That our lives become meaningless the moment we refuse to speak up about important things. You know, that's certainly true, but there are real costs. There were real costs to speaking up. And you need only look at the 800 Protestant clergymen who perished in the concentration camps. Yeah.
On that matter, especially since we're talking about speaking up, and I are part of a group called Students for Quality Education, where we advocate for students' rights.
Stand up.
Okay, so I'm a part of this organization called Students for Quality Education, and we advocate for our rights as citizens, as students, for our quality education. And basically, we have a meeting tonight at 7 p.m. in Stevenson, 3004A. If you're frustrated, if you're furious, like I am, about getting 10% less of an education, not being able to get classes, not being competitive across the United States, and really not being able maybe to even afford to go to college anymore, and you feel like your rights are being infringed, then please come. And we're having a march on March 4th. We're walking out of classes, we're having a walkout, and if you're interested in anything, you can look us up. We have a fan page on Facebook, and we're building our website, and we need any ideas as possible and as much people to come and do this as possible, because it's when we fight together that we actually make a difference. We can't do it in small groups. It needs to be a huge group.
Okay, so that's 7 o'clock,
7 o'clock.
3004A.
Yep, in Stevenson.
You're the second student to approach me about that today. But he came by my office and I gave me the same spiel, and I jokingly suggested immolation. I had just been reading about Jan Bloch, the Czech student who immolates himself in the face of the Soviet invasion of Prague in '68.
Right.
I think she
Thank you very
didn't think it funny. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious about the context in which you describe anti-Semitism and data the framework of Hitler's Christianity. Because I do believe also that anti-Semitism existed way before that time. And in Jewish history, based on Jewish history, it actually started in Egypt with Pharaoh, where people were about to tell that story, exile, and there was a Babylonian exile. Most of that was, I think, anti-Semitism as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, was that a religiously based, a sense that these people are less than us because of the religious beliefs they hold, or was it the sort of, the sense that they're just weaker than us and we can then enslave them? And,
Well, that's the question.
yeah.
If I could insert here, until the middle of the 19th century, it is much more appropriate to talk about anti-Judaism, which Steve pointed out in terms of it being against the religion. Once we integrate the ideas of Charles Darwin into our study of social life and this notion that the human race can be perfected, that there is something called grace, it becomes anti-Semitism, because before, if you renounced your Judaism and converted, you were okay. Once the racial theory started in the middle of the 19th century, once a Jew, always a Jew. So we need to think in terms of anti-Judaism, and then the more modern, shall we say, definition of that as being anti-Semitism.
Yeah, please.
And Holocaust and Genocide, I heard something that was really interesting that I haven't heard anywhere else, and I was wondering if maybe you could elaborate upon it. I heard that initially Hitler really just wanted
You mean that he just wanted the Jews out of Germany? Well, Arendt writes a little bit about that there were all these harebrained schemes to settle the Jews in Madagascar, and so these ideas were talked about, but I don't think they were ever taken very seriously.
One of the things that happened was nobody would take the Jews. There were quotas in the United States. There were even quotas against children coming to this country. The people who were willing to send their children to the United States to send them to safety. And Congress said, no, we don't want to have any mouths to feed that can't support themselves. So yes, they talked about that, but none of the countries, Holland and Belgium and France did take some early on, but after the war started, all of the gates were closed.
Yeah.
In line with that, prior to World War II, from what I read, the Jews were not a popular cause, and there was a cabinet member, I think his name is Breckinridge Long, in Roosevelt's cabinet, and it was what they were called white papers, that what was happening was coming through these white papers, and it went to his desk. He supposedly would be the one to do something about it, and he was very anti-Semitic, and did nothing. And anything that was prevailed upon was not, they did go to Roosevelt. But from what I understand, too, getting into World War II was not a popular cause in Congress, so he had to weigh his options.
Yeah. There were cables that were coming from, in fact, Switzerland, giving exact details of what was happening in Eastern Europe. And people in the State Department, old hands, the kind of white upper-class establishment, were not passing them along. Or if they were passing them to Breckinridge, he wasn't doing anything. And it wasn't until Hans Morgenthau, who was Jewish, and one of Roosevelt's very trusted advisors found out what was happening. He said to Roosevelt, you have to do something. And it was at that point that they started bringing some Jews who were in liberated Italy to the United States.
Well, I recognize it's a morally fraught issue. This, and when I was leveling blame, I said nobody ever attempted to bomb the camps. But that would be a difficult decision to undertake. You are, in fact, condemning the people who are in the camps if you bomb them.
We had a very prominent Holocaust historian by the name of Michael Berenbaum, who, in fact, gave the Robert Harris lecture one year, and you can perhaps find it on YouTube or possibly in the library as a videotape, and he talks about why Auschwitz wasn't bombed. And it's a very interesting argument, and he is a passionate Holocaust scholar and one of the first directors of the museum in Washington. So you might look for that if that's something you're interested in. Might be on YouTube, I don't know. We're hoping to get everything on YouTube soon.
Any other questions? Yeah.
In your opinion, what are the chances of avoiding genocide in the future?
I think being a professional historian, you become perhaps more cynical about these sorts of things than politicians are. And I'm by no means a pessimist about our plight here on planet Earth, but I have no doubt that there will be new cases of genocide that this class will be discussing in coming decades. And look, I mean, this lecture series predates some of the episodes of genocide that you are going to discuss this semester. This lecture series was around long before the Rwandan genocide.
Or Darfur.
Or Darfur, yeah.
Kosovo.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm not empowered to let you go.
I am, but first you have to say thank you. Thank you.